I never expected life to take such a turn. Moving back home after college, I thought it would be a temporary arrangement, something practical until I figured out my career path. Dad's second marriage was just another thing to get used to. He had married Veronica a few years after my mom passed away, and I tried to stay indifferent. But life has its surprises, and sometimes they come from the places you least expect. Veronica was different. Not that I hadn't met attractive women before, but she had this way about her, a calm confidence mixed with warmth that seemed genuine. She was maybe 15 years younger than Dad, closer to my age, and while she could easily have fit in with any crowd of younger people, she carried herself with a grace that made her seem timeless. She treated me kindly, asking about my studies and ambitions, listening in a way that felt natural, not forced. There was no reason to expect anything unusual, yet the first strange moment came out of nowhere. It was a Saturday afternoon. Veronica had asked if I could help her clean out the attic, a project Dad had been putting off for years. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a light sweater, but somehow she managed to make even that look sophisticated. As we climbed up the narrow stairs, I couldn't help but feel a little nervous, though I couldn't pinpoint why. She laughed and joked as we sorted through old boxes, making the work feel lighter than it should have been. We laughed over Dad's forgotten hobbies and trinkets, and every now and then our hands would accidentally touch as we passed things back and forth. I tried to brush it off as nothing, but there was something electric in those small, casual touches. Every time, I felt a flicker of tension that I couldn't shake off, even as I tried to ignore it. After an hour or so, Veronica decided we should take a break. "Come on," she said, brushing dust from her jeans. "I'll make us something to drink." Down in the kitchen, she poured iced tea, and we settled on the couch, still laughing about some of Dad's more unusual keepsakes. But then the laughter faded, and a quiet settled between us. She looked at me for a moment, her gaze steady, as if she were searching for something. Her hand rested casually on my arm, a simple gesture, but I felt a surge of awareness. "Ethan," she began slowly, "you've really grown up, you know?" Her words were innocent enough, but the way she said it left me feeling exposed, like she saw something in me I didn't even know was there. I stammered a response, but she only smiled, a little knowingly, and gave my arm a gentle squeeze. Veronica's hand lingered on my arm for just a second longer than I expected, sending a small shock through me that I tried my best to ignore. She looked at me with a sort of gentleness, almost as if there was something she was holding back. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it stuck with me, coloring every moment we spent together. For the next few weeks, our interactions seemed charged in a way I didn't entirely understand. Veronica would sometimes brush a hand over my shoulder as she passed, or lean in close to show me something on her phone. It was never inappropriate, yet each time, I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was a new layer to her attention, something softer and yet somehow more intense. One evening, after a long day of work, Veronica and I ended up sharing dinner alone. Dad had a late meeting, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity for us to just unwind together. The meal was simple, but as we ate, our conversation flowed easily. Veronica told me stories from her past, funny little memories about traveling in her 20s, the adventurous years before she'd met my dad. She laughed and leaned closer, her eyes shining as she spoke, and for a moment, I was struck by how youthful and vibrant she seemed. After dinner, I offered to clean up, but Veronica insisted we do it together. We washed the dishes side by side, our movements in sync as we passed plates and glasses back and forth. The radio played softly in the background, filling the kitchen with a comforting melody. At some point, Veronica's hand brushed against mine, and instead of pulling away, she let it linger there, her fingers grazing mine in a way that felt deliberate. "Ethan," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine, "I'm really glad you're here." It felt like she was speaking from somewhere deeper than just the day-to-day, as if there was something she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. I was quiet for a moment, unsure of how to respond, but I didn't want to ruin the moment either, so I just nodded, feeling a warmth in her gaze that left me quietly stunned. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every word, every touch, every glance. It was like seeing her in a different light, and as hard as I tried to make sense of it, I couldn't get her out of my mind. In the days that followed, it felt like every interaction between us was laced with an unspoken understanding. I'd find her watching me across the room, her gaze soft and thoughtful, as though she was trying to figure out something about me she hadn't noticed before. I'd catch myself watching her too, a pang of something unfamiliar settling in my chest whenever she smiled in my direction. It was impossible to ignore now, that underlying tension that neither of us wanted to acknowledge but couldn't seem to escape. One rainy afternoon, I came back from a run soaked to the bone. Veronica was in the kitchen when I walked in, and she gave me a half-amused, half-concerned look. "Ethan, you're dripping everywhere," she laughed, grabbing a towel and coming over to me. She reached up, pressing the towel to my forehead, gently drying off my hair and face. Her touch was unexpectedly tender, and I stood there, frozen, feeling her hands on me, her eyes warm and close. "Thanks," I managed to say, my voice catching slightly. She smiled, her hands lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Then she glanced toward the stairs. "Why don't you go get a hot shower? You're shivering, and we can't have you catching a cold." I nodded, still caught off guard, and headed upstairs. The warm water felt incredible as I washed off the chill from the rain. But even as I stood under the water, I couldn't shake the memory of her touch. Her kindness, the warmth in her eyes. It was like something had changed, though neither of us had said anything. Just as I was stepping out of the shower, I heard a light knock on the bathroom door. "Ethan?" came Veronica's voice. I quickly wrapped a towel around my waist, my heart pounding. Yeah." She opened the door just a crack, only enough to slip her hand through with a fresh towel and some folded clothes. "I brought you some dry clothes. I thought you might need them." "Thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Her hand lingered on the edge of the door for just a moment before she closed it again. As I looked down at the towel she'd left, I noticed that it was one of my dad's shirts, an old soft flannel that smelled faintly of home. It was a small gesture, but somehow it felt meaningful, like she was trying to offer me something familiar and comforting. When I finally went downstairs, Veronica was back in the living room, her gaze flicking to me as I entered. There was an unspoken something between us, a question we were both too cautious to voice, and I realized that whatever was happening between us had already taken root, growing stronger with every quiet moment we shared. After that day, things felt different between us, like we'd both crossed a boundary we hadn't meant to, even if no lines had truly been crossed. But the awareness lingered, intensified, even as if each shared glance, every brush of our hands, carried a deeper weight, a heavier meaning. We were both navigating uncharted waters, cautious but strangely drawn to the possibility neither of us had fully acknowledged. One evening, we were both home alone. Dad had been out of town on a last-minute business trip. Veronica suggested that we order pizza and watch a movie. It felt like a simple plan, easy and familiar, but I had to remind myself that things hadn't felt simple between us for a while now. She picked out a film, and we settled on the couch, side by side, the silence thick with something unspoken. Partway through the movie, I realized she'd inched closer, her arm brushing mine. A warmth spread through me at the contact, and I couldn't stop myself from glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. Veronica seemed to notice, and she turned, catching me in that quick moment. She held my gaze, her eyes softer than usual, something unguarded shining in them. There was an unspoken invitation there, a quiet permission that she didn't voice but didn't hide either. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand hovering just over hers. She looked down at our hands, as though weighing her own response. Then slowly, she turned her hand over, letting my fingers slip into hers. The contact was electric, a simple, charged touch that felt like it held 1,000 promises neither of us could make. As the movie played in the background, I found myself mesmerized, caught up in the quiet closeness that grew between us. Veronica's hand was warm, her fingers soft and relaxed in mine. The longer we sat like that, the more natural it felt, like we had drifted into a moment that could last forever if only we let it. Eventually, the movie ended, but neither of us moved. The house was silent, save for the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the floorboards. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, feeling her settle against me. "Ethan," she whispered after a long pause, her voice barely louder than a breath. "Yeah?" She tilted her head up to look at me, her eyes searching, as if trying to find the right words. But then, she just smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "Never mind." We stayed like that, wrapped in the quiet warmth of each other's company, knowing we were walking a fine line, but unwilling to pull back from whatever it was we'd found in each other. The closeness, the comfort, it was enough. The morning after, I woke with an odd sense of peace mixed with a nervous edge, replaying the night's quiet moments over in my mind. Veronica had already left for work by the time I came downstairs, and the house felt emptier than usual. The day dragged on. Every hour a reminder of how much I'd started looking forward to just seeing her, sharing even the simplest of moments. By the time evening rolled around, I convinced myself it was all in my head, that the feelings, the way we connected, the glances, and even holding hands, it was just me overanalyzing everything. Maybe it was me who had blurred the lines and read more into it than she had intended. That night, Veronica returned home in a flurry, arms loaded with groceries. I offered to help her unpack, and we moved in tandem, slipping into an easy rhythm as we put away the items. There was a comfort in working side by side, an unspoken familiarity, as if this was how it had always been, the two of us working together quietly in sync. "You've been quiet today," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. I shrugged, trying to keep things casual, just thinking about things. She looked at me, her expression thoughtful, as if she was about to ask more. But then, she simply smiled, her gaze soft. "Well, I'm glad you're here, Ethan. I know your dad appreciates it too." "Yeah," I replied, though I wasn't sure if that was the entire truth. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly torn. My mind told me to pull back, to set clear boundaries, but whenever she'd come home, our conversations would naturally ease into that same familiar flow. I could tell she sensed something had shifted. There was a slight edge to her, like she was navigating something just as complicated as I was. One weekend evening, while my dad was out again, I'd set up a small barbecue on the porch. Veronica joined me, and we ate under the stars, the sound of crickets filling the silence between our quiet laughter and stories. It felt like a moment frozen in time, one that neither of us wanted to let go of. As the night deepened, she shifted closer, and I could feel her gaze on me, warm and searching. Without a word, she placed her hand over mine, just like she had that night on the couch. Her fingers curled into mine, and I felt my pulse quicken, my heart pounding in my chest. She looked up at me, a mixture of hesitation and something deeper shining in her eyes. "I don't think I realized how much I needed someone like you here, Ethan," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the night. I looked at her, feeling the weight of her words, the vulnerability she was sharing with me. In that moment, everything else faded, the questions, the doubts, the fear of what it might mean. All that mattered was the connection we shared, a quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "Me too," I whispered, unable to say anything more, knowing that no words could capture what was truly going on between us. And as we sat there, wrapped in the warmth of the night and each other's company, I knew that whatever came next, neither of us would face it alone. After that night, something had undeniably shifted between us, but instead of making things more complicated, it seemed to bring a strange sense of clarity. The boundary was still there, but somehow we had both settled into a kind of mutual understanding, a quiet comfort that didn't need to be defined. But then came the day my dad announced he would be leaving town for work again, this time for over a week. He talked about it over dinner, unaware of the quick, tense glances Veronica and I exchanged across the table. I hadn't expected him to be gone so soon or for so long. The night he left, the house felt even emptier, the silence between Veronica and me almost reverent, like we were treading carefully around a deep well of emotions neither of us could fully understand. But somehow, the emptiness also felt liberating, a kind of space that gave us permission to be open in ways we hadn't before. As the days passed, our time together grew easier. We'd spend our evenings cooking dinner, sharing stories, and lingering over glasses of wine. One evening, As we washed up the dishes, she brushed her fingers along my hand, just a fleeting touch, but it set my skin tingling. We looked at each other, and without a word, she took my hand, leading me to the porch to sit and talk under the stars, just as we had before. By the time the week was nearly over, the pull between us felt undeniable, like a magnetic force that neither of us wanted to resist. That Friday night, Veronica cooked one of her favorite meals, and we ate with easy laughter and quiet smiles that seemed to say more than words ever could. As the night deepened, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze turning thoughtful. "Ethan," she said softly, "I don't think I ever really thanked you for everything you've done for me, for us, by being here." She paused, as if searching for the right words, then looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "You're more than just family, you know. It's like you're my friend." I felt my heart thudding, and I reached across the table, taking her hand gently in mine. "You've done more for me than you know, Veronica. I don't think I could ever really thank you enough." She squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening, and for a moment, we just sat there, holding on as if letting go might mean losing something neither of us was ready to face. I felt a warmth between us, a rare, almost fragile kind of closeness that felt more powerful than words. Without another thought, I leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, something instinctive, almost innocent. She closed her eyes, her face softening as she leaned into the kiss. When I pulled back, her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew that whatever we were feeling, it was real. It was as real as the stars above us, as the quiet night that held our secrets. We sat together for a long while, the silence warm and comforting, until finally, she reached out, her hand resting on my cheek. "Whatever happens, Ethan," she whispered, "know that you mean the world to me." In the stillness of that night, we held on to each other, finding comfort in the quiet bond we'd built, something that felt rare and unbreakable. And in that moment, I knew I'd never forget this, no matter what came next. The morning my dad was due back, the house was filled with an almost frantic energy. Veronica was bustling around, making sure everything was in order, straightening up and checking the time as though the world depended on it. I had this heavy, strange feeling in my chest, knowing that things would go back to how they were before, at least on the surface, and that's how it went. He came home, greeted us both with that same wide smile and endless stories about his work trip, filling the house with a kind of noise and life that made everything we'd share that week seem like a dream. But nothing was quite the same between Veronica and me. When our eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding, a look that acknowledged everything without saying anything. It was as though we both knew we were walking a tightrope, trying to balance what had happened with what needed to stay hidden. I kept busy, filling my days with extra hours at work and catching up with friends, trying to get some distance from everything that had happened. But no matter how far I tried to pull myself away, Veronica was always there, lingering in my thoughts. About a month passed, and things began to settle back into a familiar routine, though now every interaction with her felt loaded, like there was a second conversation happening beneath the surface of our words. One evening, when I was about to leave for a friend's party, Veronica caught me by the door. She wore a soft, thoughtful expression, her fingers lightly touching my arm. "Ethan, do you have a second?" "Of course," I said, not sure what to expect. We sat down in the living room, and she took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on her hands. I just wanted to make sure we're okay." She looked up, her eyes searching mine. I mean, with everything that's happened, I felt my heart tighten. I didn't know if we'd ever be okay in the way she meant, but I nodded, a soft smile playing at my lips. "We are, Veronica. I promise." A gentle relief crossed her face. "Good. I just don't want things to be weird between us." "Nothing could ever change what we have," I said, the words coming out more earnestly than I'd intended. Veronica's eyes softened, and she reached over, her hand resting on mine. We stayed like that for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between us, before she leaned back, giving me one of her warm, genuine smiles. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." As I headed out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just closed a chapter, one I'd never be able to reopen. But in a strange way, it felt like the right thing, like something we both needed. Time passed in a blur after that conversation. Life resumed a steady rhythm. Veronica and I shared knowing glances and brief, subtle conversations that held worlds of understanding in a single exchange, but we respected the unspoken boundary we'd placed between us. Somehow, that kept the memories we shared safe and untouched. My father never caught on to anything. He was back to his routines, none the wiser to the undercurrents that existed between his wife and son. For Veronica and me, it was as if we had tucked away that time in a place only the two of us knew existed. With each passing week, I felt the tension between us ease. We found new ways to be close, quiet talks in the kitchen over morning coffee, moments of shared laughter that didn't need any explanation, and an unbreakable connection that grew even without the intensity of those hidden moments. But on some days, I catch myself lingering on those memories. The warmth of her touch, her whispered reassurances, the way she looked at me when no one else was watching. They were like half-forgotten dreams that surfaced in my mind, moments that reminded me of everything we had, even if it was something we could never truly claim. A year later, I had to move for work, a big step, something I'd been working towards for a while. Veronica was supportive, even proud of me, though there was a sadness in her eyes when we talked about it. The night before I left, we shared a quiet evening together, just the two of us. My father was away again, and the house was wrapped in the same stillness that had once held so many unspoken possibilities. We talked about the future, about the things I hoped to accomplish and the new life waiting for me in another city. She encouraged me, and we talked about how I'd visit often and keep in touch. But beneath all that, there was something else, a feeling of finality. At the end of the night, Veronica walked me to the door, and we lingered there in the silence, both knowing it might be a long time before we saw each other like this again. She reached up, her hand brushing my cheek as she gave me a sad, gentle smile. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to do incredible things. Just remember, I'm always here if you ever need me." I wrapped my arms around her in a tight embrace, holding onto the warmth of her, the familiar scent, and the comfort that had been my anchor through so much. When I pulled back, there was a softness in her gaze that held all the things we'd never say out loud. "Thank you, Veronica, for everything." We said our goodbyes, and I walked away, feeling the weight of all that was left behind. The years that followed took me to new places and brought new faces into my life. But those memories stayed with me, a secret chapter of my life that shaped me in ways I could never fully explain. And every so often, when I thought of home, I thought of her, my stepmother, my friend, and, in her own way, the keeper of my heart. Years later, life had taken me far from that small town and the quiet house I once called home. I built a career, settled into new cities, met people who became important parts of my world. But some bonds, I'd learned, are woven too deeply to fade with time and distance. On a cool autumn morning, I got a call from my father. His voice was warm, the kind of tone he used only when he was in the best of spirits, and he told me that he and Veronica were celebrating their anniversary with a trip. He invited me to join them if I was free, and I promised I would make it. Returning to the old house felt surreal. There was a timelessness to it, like I was walking back into a chapter of my life that still felt unfinished. Veronica greeted me with that familiar smile, a touch of pride in her eyes. She was still the woman I'd known, vibrant, graceful, with a quiet strength that had always drawn me to her. The weekend passed with laughter, shared memories, and a sense of belonging that reminded me of what home truly meant. But on the last night, as the house quieted and the stars blinked in the darkened sky, Veronica found me out on the back porch, where the scent of pine filled the air. She stood beside me, both of us staring out into the night. There was a peacefulness to it, a calm that held everything we'd once shared and everything we'd moved beyond. "It's good to see you so happy, Ethan," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. I turned to her, meeting her gaze. "And you too. I don't think I ever thanked you enough for everything She placed a hand on mine, her touch as gentle and familiar as I remembered. There's nothing to thank me for. Just know I'll always be here. And I'm proud of the man you've become. We stayed there side by side in the quiet, until the chill in the air reminded us it was time to go back inside. When we did, it was with a feeling of closure, as if every part of that unspoken past had found its place. And though I left again, taking with me the strength she'd given me, I knew that our story was a part of me, woven into who I was. Some connections, I realized, weren't bound by distance or time. They simply were timeless, steadfast, and unbreakable, just like the bond between Veronica and me.